November 15, 1938. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. 3 inmates cornered Al Capone in the shower block at 2:47 p.m. They had shanks. They had a plan. They had 30 seconds before the guards made their rounds. What they didn't have was the whole story. Capone went down hard, blood mixed with soap water. The inmates walked away thinking they'd just made their names in prison history. Guard Vincent Torino found Capone unconscious, skull cracked against the concrete wall. 72 hours later, all 3 attackers were dead. Not stabbed, not beaten, dead in ways that made hardened criminals cross themselves and pray. The warden called it coincidence. The FBI called it impossible. But the guards who walked those halls knew better. They knew Capone had orchestrated his own attack. They knew those 3 men had been marked from the moment they raised their weapons. And they knew that sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one lying bleeding on the floor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first body turned up in cell block D at dawn on November 18th. Tommy the Blade Marconi, the one who'd carved his initials into Capone's shoulder blade, was found hanging from his bunk with a bedsheet around his neck. Nothing unusual there. Suicide was as common as cold coffee on the rock. What made the guards stop and stare was the message carved into Tommy's forehead: "Chicago sends its regards." Vincent Torino had been working the night shift, making his rounds with the methodical precision that kept guards alive in this concrete tomb floating in San Francisco Bay. At 26, Vinny had already learned the cardinal rule of Alcatraz: see nothing, hear nothing, and for God's sake, never get involved. But when he'd found Capone bleeding in those showers 3 days earlier, something had shifted. The way Capone had looked at him, not grateful, not desperate, but calculating, had planted a seed of unease that grew with each passing hour. The second death came at lunch. Mickey Ears Sullivan, who'd held Capone down while the others worked him over, choked on his meatloaf, just started gagging and couldn't stop. By the time the doc arrived, Mickey's face was purple and his eyes had rolled back white. Natural causes, they said. Allergic reaction to something in the kitchen. But Vinny had been watching the kitchen staff that morning, had seen the new guy, Giuseppe something or other, slip a small envelope to Cookie Martinez before the lunch prep started, had seen Cookie's hands shake as he ladled gravy onto certain plates, had seen Giuseppe disappear into the supply closet and not come out for an hour. The third man, Johnny Scar Benedetto, lasted until evening count. They found him in the library, slumped over a copy of Treasure Island. Heart attack, the medical report would say, perfectly natural for a 34-year-old man with the constitution of an ox to just drop dead while reading about pirates. Vinny stood outside Johnny's cell that night, watching the cleanup crew work with their mops and disinfectant. The smell of death and bleach mixed together like some unholy perfume. Through the bars he could see Capone's cell 3 blocks over. The man was sitting on his bunk, reading his own book by candlelight, calm as a priest at Sunday Mass. "Hell of a thing," said Frank Morrison, the senior guard who'd been working Alcatraz since it opened. Frank was pushing 60, with gray stubble and hands that shook from too much coffee and too many years watching men destroy each other. 3 guys, 3 days, 3 different ways to die. Coincidence, Vinny said, though the word tasted like ash in his mouth. Frank laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Son, I've been doing this job since before you could spell prison. There's no such thing as coincidence when Alphonse Capone's involved." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You know what they're saying in Chicago? That Scarface still has people on the outside. People who owe him favors. People who remember what happens when you cross the Chicago outfit." "He's locked up," Vinny protested. "No visitors except his lawyer. No phone calls. No mail gets in or out without inspection. You think that matters to a man who built an empire on blood and fear?" Frank shook his head. "Capone's been planning this since the day he walked through those doors. The shower attack wasn't random violence, boy. It was theater. He let those idiots think they were making a play against him, when really they were just signing their own death warrants." Vinny felt something cold crawl up his spine. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Capone wanted to send a message. To every con in this place, to every cop in Chicago, to everyone who might be thinking he's lost his touch just because he's behind bars. Frank gestured toward the cell block where 3 men had died in as many days. Message received. That night, Vinny couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the look in Capone's eyes when he'd found him bleeding on the shower floor. Not pain, not fear, something else entirely, something that looked almost like satisfaction. At 3 in the morning, Vinny made his rounds past Capone's cell. The man was awake, standing at his small window, looking out at the dark waters of San Francisco Bay. When he heard Vinny's footsteps, he turned. "Officer Torino," Capone said quietly. His voice was cultured, almost gentle. Nothing like the snarling gangster the newspapers portrayed. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" Vinny stopped walking. Every instinct told him to keep moving, to not engage, to pretend he hadn't heard. But something made him step closer to the bars. "You killed them," Vinny said. It wasn't a question. Capone smiled. In the dim light filtering through the corridor, his gold teeth caught the glow like tiny stars. "I killed nobody, Officer Torino. I've been locked in this cage for 3 days, under medical observation. How could I possibly hurt anyone? But you—" "I what?" Capone's smile widened. "I survived? Yes, I did. And survival, young man, sometimes requires making very old debts come due." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Vinny's hand instinctively moved to his nightstick, though what good it would do against a man locked behind steel bars he couldn't say. Capone noticed the gesture and chuckled, a sound like gravel rolling down a hill. "Relax, Officer Torino. You're not on my list." Capone turned back to his window, hands clasped behind his back. "Tell me, do you have family? Brothers? Sisters?" Every alarm bell in Vinny's head started ringing at once. "That's none of your business. Everything that happens in my world is my business." Capone's reflection gazed back at him from the dark glass. "I make it a point to know the men who guard me. Vincent Anthony Torino, born Brooklyn, 1912. Father died in the shipyards when you were 15. Mother remarried a drunk who liked to use his fists. You joined the prison service to get away from home and send money back to—" He paused, savoring the moment. "Little brother Danny, wasn't it? Sweet kid, from what I hear. Just started his sophomore year at Brooklyn College." The blood drained from Vinny's face. "How do you—" "Knowledge is power, son. And power is the only currency that matters in places like this." Capone turned around slowly, his pale eyes reflecting the corridor's dim lighting. "Danny's studying to be a teacher, right? Noble profession. Be a shame if something happened to interrupt his education." Vinny's fingers wrapped around the cold steel bars. "If you touch him—" "Touch him?" Capone's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Officer Torino, you wound me. I'm a businessman, not a monster. I simply believe in mutual understanding between colleagues." The corridor felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. Vinny had heard stories about guards who got too close to the inmates, who found themselves caught in webs they couldn't escape. He'd always told himself he was smarter than that, stronger than that. But standing here, listening to Capone speak his brother's name with casual familiarity, Vinny felt like a mouse staring down a snake. "What do you want?" Capone smiled again, but this time there was genuine warmth in it. "Right now, nothing at all. Consider this conversation an investment in our future friendship. You've been respectful to me, Officer Torino. Professional. That means something in my line of work. I treat all the inmates the same." "No, you don't." Capone's voice dropped lower, more intimate. "You treat the violent ones with caution, the crazy ones with fear, the broken ones with pity. But me? You treat me like a man. That's rarer than you might think." Vinny wanted to walk away, to pretend this conversation never happened. But something kept his feet planted on the cold concrete floor. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was terror. Or maybe it was the sick fascination of watching a master at work. "The men who attacked you," Vinny said carefully, "they're all dead. Tragic coincidence." Capone's expression didn't change, though I suppose that's what happens when you make enemies of the wrong people. Tommy, Mickey, Johnny. They thought because I was locked up, I was finished. They forgot that respect and fear don't disappear just because you're wearing prison stripes. But how? Capone held up a hand, stopping him. Some questions are better left unasked, Officer Torino. Some knowledge is dangerous to possess. What matters is that order has been restored. The other inmates understand now that there are consequences for certain actions. The guards understand that peace in this place requires cooperation from all parties. A door slams somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing through the empty corridors like a gunshot. Vinny jumped, but Capone didn't even blink. "You should get some sleep," Capone said, settling onto his narrow bunk. "Morning shift starts in a few hours, and tired guards make mistakes. Can't have that, especially not with your brother counting on those paychecks." Vinny wanted to say something cutting, something that would restore the balance of power between guard and prisoner, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself nodding and backing away from the cell, his footsteps echoing hollowly as he continued his rounds. The rest of the night passed in a blur of routine checks and paperwork. But every few minutes, Vinny found his thoughts drifting back to that conversation, to the casual way Capone had mentioned Danny, to the implications hidden beneath those cultured words. When morning came, Vinny walked home to his small apartment near the docks, bone-tired but unable to sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the letter from Danny that had arrived the previous week, full of excitement about his classes, his girlfriend, his plans for the future, normal things, safe things, things that suddenly felt very fragile indeed. 3 days passed in uneasy quiet. Vinny moved through his shifts like a man walking underwater, hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every casual comment from his fellow guards. Capone had returned to his usual routine, reading, writing letters that would never be sent, playing chess against himself. To anyone watching, he seemed like just another aging gangster serving out his time. But Vinny could feel those pale eyes tracking him during rounds, could sense the weight of unspoken understanding hanging between them like a loaded gun. The envelope arrived on Tuesday morning, slipped under his apartment door while he slept off another sleepless night shift. No postmark, no return address, just his name written in careful script across cream-colored paper that was far too expensive for a guard's salary. Vinny's hands trembled as he tore it open. Inside was a single photograph, Danny walking across the Brooklyn College campus, his arms full of books, completely unaware that someone with a camera was watching him from the shadows. On the back, someone had written a date and time, yesterday, 3:17 p.m. The message was clear. We can reach him any time we want. Vinny dropped the photograph like it was on fire, watching it flutter to the kitchen floor where it landed face up, Danny's smile mocking him from across 3,000 miles of distance. His little brother, who still wrote letters full of excitement about his classes and his girl and his dreams of teaching kids in some safe suburban school somewhere. Danny, who had no idea that his future now hung in the balance of whatever sick game Al Capone was playing. The phone rang. Vinny stared at it for 3 rings before finding the courage to pick up the receiver. No one ever called him at home. His mother was dead. His stepfather could go to hell. Danny only wrote letters the old-fashioned way because long-distance calls cost too much for a college student working nights at a diner to afford. "Hello?" His voice came out as a croak. "Vincent." The voice was calm, cultured, unmistakably familiar despite the crackling long-distance connection. "I trust you received my gift." Vinny's legs gave out. He collapsed into the kitchen chair, the phone cord stretching taut. "This is impossible. You're locked up. You can't make phone calls." Capone's laugh was soft, almost paternal. "Oh, my boy, you have so much to learn about the way the world really works. Money talks in any language, even in a place like Alcatraz, especially in a place like Alcatraz. What do you want?" The words came out as barely a whisper. "I want what every man wants, Vincent. Security, peace of mind, the knowledge that my remaining years in this concrete tomb will pass without unnecessary complications." There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling in the background. "Your brother is quite handsome, isn't he? That photograph doesn't quite capture how young he looks, how vulnerable." Rage and terror warred in Vinny's chest, choking off his air. "If you hurt him—" "Hurt him? Vincent, you're not listening. I don't want to hurt anyone. Quite the opposite, in fact. I want to protect things, valuable things, like promising young men trying to make something of themselves, like hard-working guards trying to do right by their families. The kitchen felt like it was spinning around him. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would compromise your professional integrity." Capone's voice took on the tone of a reasonable businessman discussing a simple transaction. "I simply need someone I can trust, someone who understands that certain conversations should remain private, that certain irregularities in my daily routine might occasionally be overlooked." "You're asking me to be your inside man." "I'm asking you to be practical, Vincent. To understand that in this world, we all serve someone. The question is whether we choose our masters or whether they choose us." Another pause. "Your brother Danny is a good boy. Honor student. Plans to teach elementary school children. He has his whole life ahead of him. It would be tragic if that life were shortened by unfortunate circumstances." Vinny closed his eyes, but Danny's smile still burned behind his eyelids. 20 years old and full of hope, completely unaware that his fate was being decided in a conversation between his brother and the most dangerous man in America. "What exactly would you need from me?" "Small things, a blind eye here and there, perhaps a message delivered occasionally. Nothing that would endanger anyone, including yourself." Capone's voice turned almost gentle. "I'm not a monster, Vincent, despite what the newspapers say. I'm simply a man who believes in taking care of those who take care of him." Through his kitchen window, Vinny could see the morning ferry heading toward Alcatraz, carrying fresh guards to replace the night shift. In a few hours, he would be back on the Rock, walking those same corridors, pretending nothing had changed, but everything had changed. The photograph on his kitchen floor proved that. The voice on the phone proved that. Al Capone owned him now. The click of the phone hanging up echoed through Vinny's kitchen like a death knell. He sat frozen at his small table, staring at Danny's photograph on the floor, his brother's face caught mid-laugh by some stranger's camera. The cream-colored paper seemed to glow against the worn linoleum, a beacon of his complete and utter helplessness. Just walk away, he told himself. Pack a bag, catch the next train to Brooklyn, grab Danny, and disappear. But even as the thought formed, he knew how ridiculous it was. You don't run from Al Capone. You don't hide from the Chicago outfit. The photograph proved they could reach Danny anytime, anywhere. Running would only make things worse. Vinny's hands shook as he picked up the picture, studied every detail, the ivy-covered buildings, the other students walking past, the timestamp on the back. Yesterday afternoon, while Vinny was making his rounds on Alcatraz, Danny had been followed, photographed, marked. The precision of it made his stomach churn. He thought about calling in sick, staying home, pretending this wasn't happening. But that ferry would keep running whether he was on it or not, and his absence would be noticed, questioned, reported. Capone would know he was wavering, and wavering men were dangerous to have as allies. The walk to the dock felt like a death march. Other guards nodded their usual greetings, but their voices sounded distant, muffled, like he was hearing them from underwater. Morrison was already aboard, nursing his coffee and complaining about his wife's cooking. Rodriguez was reading yesterday's newspaper, shaking his head at headlines about the war brewing in Europe. Normal men living normal lives, unaware that one of their colleagues had just been conscripted into Al Capone's private army. "You look like hell, Torino," Morrison said as the ferry churned toward the island. "You getting sick?" "Didn't sleep well." Vinny gripped the railing, watching Alcatraz grow larger ahead of them. The fortress looked different now, not like a prison keeping dangerous men in, but like a trap closing around him. "Better get some rest. Can't afford to have guards falling asleep on the job, especially with the heat we've been getting from the warden about those 3 deaths. Morrison's voice dropped lower. "Word is they're bringing in federal investigators, FBI boys asking questions about how 3 men die in 3 days without anyone noticing anything suspicious." Vinny's blood turned to ice water. "Investigators? That's what I heard. Someone downtown thinks maybe we've got problems on the inside. Guards looking the other way, taking money, that sort of thing." Morrison studied Vinny's face. "Course, we all know that's garbage. None of us would be stupid enough to get mixed up with those animals." The ferry bumped against the dock with a grinding screech of metal on stone. Vinny followed the other guards up the narrow path to the prison entrance, his legs moving automatically while his mind raced. Federal investigators meant questions, background checks, phone records. If they discovered Capone had somehow made contact with the outside world, if they traced that call back to Vinny's apartment. "Torino!" The voice cracked like a whip across the entry yard. Vinny turned to see Warden Kretzer striding toward him, his face grim as winter. Behind him walked two men in dark suits and identical expressions of professional suspicion. Federal agents, had to be. "Sir?" Vinny's voice came out steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "These gentlemen are from the Bureau. They want to ask you some questions about the incidents last week." Kretzer's eyes were cold, calculating. "I told them you were the one who found Capone after the shower attack, that you might have insights into what happened." The taller agent stepped forward, extending his hand. "Agent Phillips, FBI. This is Agent Chen. We'd like to speak with you privately, if you don't mind." Vinny shook the offered hand, amazed his palm wasn't visibly sweating. "Of course. Whatever I can do to help." They led him to a small office overlooking the exercise yard. Through the window, Vinny could see inmates moving in their carefully supervised groups. Somewhere down there, Capone was probably enjoying his morning walk, breathing fresh air, planning his next move in whatever elaborate game he was playing. "You discovered Capone after he was assaulted," Agent Phillips said, settling into a chair across from Vinny. "Tell us exactly what you saw." Vinny recounted the story he'd already told a dozen times, finding Capone bleeding, calling for medical help, securing the scene. The agents listened with professional attention, occasionally asking for clarification on timing or details. Normal questions, routine investigation. Then Agent Chen leaned forward. "Did Capone say anything to you, either that night or since?" The moment stretched like a taut wire. Vinny could feel his future balancing on his next words. Tell the truth, and he might be safe from prosecution, but Danny would die. Lie, and he became Capone's accomplice in whatever was coming next. "No," Vinny said. "Nothing unusual. Just thank me for getting help." Agent Chen made a note. "And you haven't observed any changes in his behavior since then? Nothing that seemed suspicious or out of the ordinary?" In his mind, Vinny heard Capone's cultured voice over the phone, saw Danny's photograph fluttering to his kitchen floor. "No, sir, nothing at all." The lie tasted like ashes, but it sealed his fate completely. He belonged to Capone now. The agents left after another hour of questions, their footsteps echoing down the corridor like a countdown timer. Vinny sat alone in the empty office, watching shadows creep across the exercise yard as morning shifted toward noon. Through the reinforced glass, he could see inmates moving through their routines, work details heading to the laundry, others returning from the library. Normal prison rhythms that suddenly felt like an elaborate dance choreographed by invisible hands. A knock on the doorframe made him jump. Warden Kretzer stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Walk with me, Torino." They moved through the administrative wing in silence, past offices where clerks typed reports and filed paperwork that would eventually disappear into government filing cabinets. The warden's pace was measured, deliberate, like a man choosing his words carefully. 37 years I've been in corrections," Kretzer said finally. "Started as a guard in San Quentin when I was barely older than you are now. You know what I've learned in all that time?" Vinny's throat felt dry. "Sir?" "Prison is like a living organism. When something disrupts the balance, you can feel it in the walls themselves. The inmates sense it, the guards sense it, even the damn seagulls sense it." Kretzer stopped beside a window overlooking the dining hall. "Something's been disrupted here, son. Those 3 deaths weren't random violence. They were precise, professional. And that scares me more than any riot or escape attempt ever could." Below them, inmates were filing in for lunch. Vinny spotted Capone near the middle of the line, moving with his usual unhurried confidence. Even from this distance, even surrounded by hundreds of other prisoners, he seemed to command space around himself. "The FBI thinks we have a corruption problem," Kretzer continued. "Someone on the inside who's been compromised. They're going to be watching everything now. Phone records, mail, visitors, guard schedules, any irregularity, any deviation from protocol, and they'll come down on us like hammers." Vinny forced himself to nod. "Understood, sir. I hope so, because if they find evidence of guard involvement in those deaths, it won't just be termination, it'll be federal charges. Prison time. Kretzer's eyes bored into him. And I won't be able to protect anyone, no matter how long they've been under my command or how much I might want to help them. The words hung in the air like a noose. Vinny understood perfectly. Kretzer suspected something but couldn't prove it. This was a warning, maybe the only one he'd get. Sir, I would never. I know what you'd never do under normal circumstances, son. But circumstances have a way of changing when dangerous men start applying pressure. Kretzer turned away from the window. Whatever's happening here, whatever web is being spun, my advice is to cut yourself free before you get so tangled up that cutting free becomes impossible. After the warden left, Vinny found himself walking the corridors like a ghost, going through the motions of his duties while his mind churned. Every face seemed suspicious now. Every casual conversation between inmates carried hidden meanings. He found himself studying his fellow guards with new eyes. Which ones seemed nervous? Which ones had been asking unusual questions or deviating from normal routines? The afternoon shift change brought Morrison up from the lower level, his face pale and drawn. Jesus Christ, Torino, Morrison whispered, pulling him aside near the guard station. You hear what happened in the workshop? Vinny's stomach dropped. What? Inmate named Kowalski, the big Polak who's been running book for the inmates? They found him with his neck broken. Made it look like an accident, heavy machinery malfunction, but the marks don't match the story. 4 deaths in 10 days. The number hit Vinny like a physical blow. They're saying it was Kowalski who set up the shower attack on Capone, Morrison continued, his voice barely audible. Word is he was taking bets on whether the old man would survive. Turns out he bet wrong. Vinny leaned against the concrete wall, feeling the cold seep through his uniform. This wasn't random prison violence anymore. This was systematic elimination, one by one, of everyone connected to the attack on Capone. And somehow, impossibly, it was being orchestrated by a man locked in solitary confinement with no access to the outside world except through a guard, through someone like Vinny. The realization hit him with sickening clarity. Capone hadn't just recruited him as an insurance policy for the future. He'd been planning this from the beginning. The attack in the showers, the subsequent revenge killings, the photographs of Danny, all of it was designed to create the perfect inside man, someone so compromised, so terrified, so completely owned that he would never dare betray his new master. Vinny thought about the federal agents, their sharp eyes and careful questions, about Warden Kretzer's warning, about Danny walking across a college campus, completely unaware that his life hung by a thread. The trap wasn't just closing around him anymore. It had already snapped shut. The sound of Morrison's footsteps fading down the corridor left Vinny alone with a truth that made his knees buckle. He pressed his back against the cold concrete wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor like a broken man. The attack was planned. Not just tolerated, not just allowed to happen. Planned. By Capone himself. The pieces fell together with horrifying precision. Capone had orchestrated his own beating, knowing it would trigger exactly this chain of events. The revenge killings weren't spontaneous prison justice. They were methodical execution of a predetermined list. And Vinny, poor stupid Vinny, had been selected as the inside facilitator long before that first photograph arrived at his apartment. He thought back to that morning 3 weeks ago when he'd volunteered to work the shower detail. Volunteered. Morrison had been scheduled originally, but his wife was sick, and he'd asked around for someone to cover. Vinny had raised his hand without thinking, just trying to be helpful, earn some goodwill with the other guards. Except Morrison's wife hadn't been sick. Not really sick. She'd complained of a headache, taken to bed for the morning, then felt fine by afternoon. A convenient excuse that had put Vinny exactly where Capone needed him to be. Oh God, he whispered to the empty corridor. How long have you been watching me? The answer came with crystalline clarity. Since the beginning. Since the day he'd applied for the job. Since his background check revealed a younger brother in college, struggling financially, vulnerable. Since someone had decided that Vincent Torino, young, honest, desperate to do right by his family, would make the perfect unwitting pawn. Every kindness he'd shown the inmates, every moment of basic human decency, had been catalogued and evaluated. His compassion had made him a target. His love for Danny had made him a weapon. Vinny hauled himself to his feet, legs shaking. He had to find out how deep this went, how many other guards were involved, how long Capone had been planning this elaborate charade. The medical wing was quiet during the afternoon shift change. Vinny slipped inside, nodding to the duty nurse who barely looked up from her paperwork. Capone's medical file was locked in the physician's office, but Vinny had master keys for emergency situations. His hands trembled as he opened the file cabinet, pulled out the thick folder documenting months of Capone's medical treatment. The shower attack report was near the front, detailed photos of his injuries, doctor's notes about the severity of the beating, projected recovery time. But as Vinny studied the photographs more carefully, something nagged at him: the bruising patterns, the placement of the cuts. He'd seen enough prison violence to know what a real beating looked like: chaotic, frenzied, born of rage and opportunity. These injuries were different, precise, almost surgical in their restraint. A loose paper fell from the back of the file, a preliminary medical assessment written in hurried script. Vinny's blood turned to ice as he read the physician's private notes. Injuries consistent with self-infliction using blunt instrument. Patient likely struck himself repeatedly in controlled manner to simulate assault. Recommend psychological evaluation. The report was dated the day after the attack, but it had never been submitted to the administration. Someone had buried it. Find what you were looking for, Torino. Vinny spun around to find Dr. Kellerman standing in the doorway, his usually kind face cold as winter's steel. The prison physician stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Doctor, I was just stealing confidential medical files to cover your tracks? Kellerman moved to his desk, opened a drawer, pulled out a thick envelope. Don't bother lying. I've been waiting for someone to come looking for that report. Vinny stared at the envelope, recognizing the cream-colored paper. More photographs, more evidence of how completely he'd been played. How long? His voice came out as a croak. How long have I been taking Capone's money? About 6 months. Kellerman's tone was matter-of-fact, almost conversational. How long has he been planning this particular operation? Nearly a year. You were selected very carefully, Vincent. Your psychological profile, your family situation, your financial pressures, everything made you the ideal candidate. The room tilted around Vinny like the deck of a sinking ship. The other guards? Morrison? Rodriguez? Clean as whistles. You're the only one compromised on the guard staff. Kellerman smiled, and it was the coldest expression Vinny had ever seen. Capone doesn't believe in unnecessary complications. Why corrupt 10 men when one will suffice? Vinny thought about his fellow guards, their genuine concern about the recent deaths, their honest bewilderment at the violence. They were innocent. He was the cancer in their midst. The man's a genius, really, Kellerman continued, settling into his chair like they were discussing the weather. Beat himself unconscious to trigger federal investigation, knowing it would force the administration to tighten security protocols. Now he has access to guard schedules, visitor logs, mail routing, all through his helpful inside man who's too terrified to refuse. The envelope hit Vinny's hands like a live coal. Inside were photographs of Danny entering his dormitory, sitting in class, walking with a pretty blonde girl who must be the sweetheart he'd mentioned in his letters. He never intended to escape, Vinny said, the truth bitter as poison in his mouth. This isn't about getting out. No, Kellerman agreed. It's about control, about proving that even locked in the most secure prison in America, Al Capone can still reach anyone, anywhere, anytime. The doctor's eyes glittered with something approaching admiration. You think you're protecting your brother by cooperating? You're not. You're just making yourself more valuable to him. And the more valuable you become, the harder it will be for him to ever let you go. The photographs scattered across the floor as Vinny's nerveless fingers lost their grip. Danny smiled up at him from a dozen different angles, young and trusting and completely doomed. Welcome to the family business, Vincent, Dr. Kellerman said softly. I think you're going to fit right in. Vinny stared down at his brother's scattered photographs, Danny's innocent smile multiplying across the cold linoleum like accusation made manifest. The silence in Dr. Kellerman's office stretched taut as piano wire, broken only by the distant sound of inmates being called back from the exercise yard. There's still a choice, Vinny said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I could tell the FBI everything. About you, about Capone's plan, about the photographs. Kellerman leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled like a man considering an interesting chess problem. You could. And within 48 hours your brother would be dead in what appears to be a tragic automobile accident. Very sad, very convincing, and very final. But if I keep playing along, then you become more valuable with each passing day, more essential to the operation, more impossible to discard. The doctor's smile was surgical in its precision. Do you understand what you've stumbled into, Vincent? This isn't about one man's revenge anymore. Capone has spent months building a network that extends far beyond these walls. Guards who don't know they're compromised, officials who think they're accepting legitimate gifts, businessmen who believe they're making shrewd investments. Vinny knelt slowly, gathering Danny's photographs with trembling hands. Each image felt like handling live ammunition. Danny laughing with friends, Danny studying in the library, Danny walking hand in hand with the blonde girl whose name Vinny didn't even know, but whose life now hung in the balance alongside his brother's. The federal investigation, Vinny said, forcing his mind to work through the implications. Capone wanted that too. Of course. Nothing reveals the structure of an organization quite like watching how it responds to pressure. Who panics? Who stays calm? Who has resources they shouldn't have access to? Kellerman opened another drawer, pulled out a manila folder. Every conversation those agents had today, every question they asked, every suspicion they voiced, all of it will be in his hands by morning. The folder hit the desk with a soft thud. Inside, Vinny could see official FBI letterhead, photocopied reports, surveillance photographs of the agents themselves entering the prison. The scope of the corruption made his vision blur. How many people? He asked. Does it matter? You're not going to stop this, Vincent. You're barely going to survive it. Kellerman stood, moved to the small window overlooking the prison yard. The question isn't how to escape Capone's web. The question is how to position yourself so that when it expands, and it will expand, you're not the one who gets crushed in the process. Vinny thought about Warden Kretzer's warning, about Morrison's genuine shock at each new death, about the other guards who went home each night believing they served justice instead of feeding a monster. They would all be swept away when this came to light. Every honest man in the place would be tainted by association. There has to be something, he said desperately. Some way to what? Outsmart Al Capone? Kellerman's laugh was soft and bitter. The man who built an empire from nothing, who corrupted an entire city, who's now proving that a federal prison is just another neighborhood to be conquered. The doctor turned from the window, his eyes holding something that might have been pity. Vincent, you're 24 years old. You guard prisoners for $70 a month. What exactly do you think you can do against a machine that's been in motion for decades? The weight of helplessness settled on Vinny's shoulders like a lead blanket. Every option led to Danny's death. Every choice made him more complicit in whatever was coming. He was trapped in a maze where every path led deeper into darkness. What does he want from me next? The words came out hollow, defeated. Kellerman smiled, and for a moment his expression almost resembled the kindly physician Vinny had known for months. Nothing dramatic, just a small favor. Agent Phillips left his briefcase in the interview room while he was questioning you. It's still there, locked in the warden's office overnight. The cleaning crew has master keys. You want me to? I want you to understand that this is how it works. One small compromise leads to another, each favor slightly larger than the last, until one day you realize you're not a prison guard who's being blackmailed. You're a criminal who happens to wear a uniform. Vinny closed his eyes, feeling the last of his innocence crumble like sand between his fingers. When he opened them again, Dr. Kellerman was holding out a set of keys that gleamed like silver in the fluorescent light. Welcome to your real education, Vincent, the doctor said softly. Class is now in session. Vinny stared at the keys in Kellerman's outstretched hand, their silver surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent light like tiny mirrors, showing him 1,000 different versions of his own damnation. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Take them, Kellerman said softly, his voice carrying the patience of a man who knew the outcome was inevitable. Or don't. But understand that your hesitation won't save your brother. It will only make his death more painful when it comes. The keys felt cold as ice when Vinny's fingers closed around them, heavier than they should have been, as if they were made of lead instead of metal. He understood with crystalline clarity that he was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, from victim to accomplice, from guardian to criminal. "Good," Kellerman murmured, settling back into his chair. "Now let me explain exactly what you're going to find in that briefcase, and why it matters." But Vinny wasn't listening anymore. Something had shifted inside him as the keys touched his palm. Not surrender, but a cold calculation that surprised him with its intensity. He thought about Danny's photographs scattered on the floor, about the innocent guards who would be destroyed when this conspiracy came to light, about the federal agents who believed they were investigating corruption instead of walking into a trap, about Al Capone, sitting in his cell, pulling strings like a spider in the center of an impossibly complex web. "Actually," Vinny said, his voice steady for the first time in weeks, "I have a better idea." Kellerman's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh? You're right about one thing. I can't outsmart Capone. I'm just a prison guard making $70 a month." Vinny slipped the keys into his pocket, felt their weight like a promise. "But you know what Capone can't account for? Someone stupid enough to destroy himself to bring down the whole operation." The doctor's expression shifted from amused condescension to sharp attention. "Vincent, think very carefully about what you're saying." "I am thinking. For the first time in weeks, I'm thinking clearly." Vinny moved toward the door, then stopped, his hand on the knob. "You want to know Capone's fatal flaw? The thing that's going to destroy him?" Kellerman said nothing, but his knuckles had gone white where they gripped the arms of his chair. "He thinks everyone is like him," Vinny continued. "He believes that every man has a price, that everyone can be bought or threatened into submission. But some people—" Vinny's voice hardened into something that would have surprised anyone who knew the earnest young guard he'd been just a month ago. "Some people would rather burn everything down than let evil win." He opened the door, then looked back at the doctor whose face had gone pale as parchment. "Tell Capone that Vincent Torino is about to give him an education." The corridor outside was empty, the evening shift just beginning. Vinny walked toward the administrative wing with measured steps, his mind working through the implications of what he was about to do. The briefcase would contain federal intelligence about the investigation, witness statements, surveillance reports, maybe even a list of suspects. Exactly the kind of information Capone needed to stay ahead of the authorities. It would also contain something else, the perfect opportunity to expose the entire conspiracy. Vinny thought about Agent Phillips's sharp eyes, about the way the man had studied him during the interview. The agent suspected something but couldn't prove it. What if he didn't have to prove it? What if the evidence came to him with a neat bow tied around it? The warden's office was dark, locked for the night. Vinny used his master key, the one he was authorized to carry, not the stolen copies Kellerman had given him, and slipped inside. The briefcase sat on Kretzer's desk exactly where Kellerman had said it would be, black leather worn smooth by years of use. Vinny opened it carefully, photographed each document with a small camera he'd borrowed from the prison's evidence room. Financial records showing suspicious payments to prison staff. Surveillance photographs of Dr. Kellerman meeting with known associates of Capone's organization. Communication intercepts that revealed the scope of the corruption network. And at the bottom of the case, a list of targets, not suspects, but people marked for elimination. Guards who had asked too many questions, inmates who knew too much, federal agents who were getting too close to the truth. Danny's name wasn't on the list. It was never supposed to be. The photographs, the threats, all of it had been carefully crafted manipulation designed to create a compliant asset. Danny had probably never been in any real danger. The cruel irony made Vinny's hands shake as he photographed the final document. He'd been protecting a brother who didn't need protection, while betraying colleagues who trusted him completely. But that was about to change. Vinny closed the briefcase, locked the office, and walked calmly to the communications room where the prison's telephone switchboard operated through the night. The duty officer nodded as he passed, just another guard making his rounds. In 30 minutes, Agent Phillips would receive an anonymous call directing him to a specific location where he would find detailed evidence of the corruption network, complete with photographs and documentation that would expose everyone from Dr. Kellerman to Al Capone himself. The spider's web was about to collapse. The call went through at 2:47 a.m. Vinny stood in the prison's communication room, listening to Agent Phillips's groggy voice turn sharp and alert as the implications of the anonymous tip became clear. He gave the location, a dead drop behind the Alcatraz maintenance building, and hung up before the agent could ask questions. In 6 hours, when Phillips arrived for his follow-up interviews, he would already have enough evidence to dismantle the entire conspiracy. Vinny walked back to his quarters through corridors that felt different now, lighter somehow, despite what was coming. The weight that had pressed on his chest for weeks was finally lifting, replaced by something he hadn't felt since childhood, the clean exhaustion that follows doing the right thing, regardless of cost. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat by his small window watching the sun rise over San Francisco Bay, thinking about Danny's last letter. His brother had mentioned a job offer after graduation, something about working for their uncle's construction company in Chicago. A normal life, a future uncontaminated by the darkness that had consumed Vinny's world. At 8:30 a.m., the arrests began. Dr. Kellerman was taken first, led away in handcuffs while inmates pressed against their cell bars to watch. Then came the guards Vinny hadn't even suspected, 3 men who'd been feeding information to Capone's network for months. By noon, federal agents swarmed the prison like antibodies attacking an infection. Vinny was arrested at 1:15 p.m., cuffed in the same corridor where he'd made his choice 12 hours earlier. Agent Phillips read him his rights with something approaching respect in his voice, and Vinny understood that the man had put the pieces together, understood exactly who had provided the evidence that made this day possible. "Why?" Phillips asked quietly as they walked toward the boat dock. Vinny looked back at Alcatraz one final time, its walls rising from the bay like a fortress against the world's darkness. "Because some lines shouldn't be crossed," he said simply. "And some debts are worth paying." 35 years later, Vincent Torino finished his story as the Key West sun painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. The documentary filmmaker sat in stunned silence, her recording equipment still running, tears streaming down her face without shame. "You went to prison," she said finally, "for 3 years. Federal minimum security. I was out in 18 months with good behavior." Vinny's weathered hands were steady on his coffee cup, the tremor that had plagued him during the telling finally gone. "Lost my job, my pension, my reputation, but I kept my soul. And your brother?" Danny graduated summa cum laude, married that blonde girl from the photographs, raised 4 children who never knew how close they came to losing their father. Vinny smiled, and for a moment decades fell away from his face. He died last year, peaceful, surrounded by grandchildren, never knew the whole truth about what happened on the rock. The filmmaker leaned forward. "But Capone, his revenge, you said it followed you home?" Vinny was quiet for a long moment, watching pelicans dive for fish in the harbor. "Al Capone taught me something that took me 35 years to understand. He showed me that evil's greatest victory isn't corruption. It's the fear of corruption, the way it makes good people hesitate when they should act, stay silent when they should speak." He stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. "I spent decades running from shadows, convinced his network was still hunting me, afraid to get too close to anyone, to build anything worth protecting. Only realized a few years ago that the real revenge wasn't what they might do to me. It was what I'd done to myself. What changed? Hurricane Irma. Boat was destroyed. Lost everything I'd built down here." Vinny gestured toward his rebuilt charter vessel bobbing at the dock. "Figured if I was going to start over at 70, I might as well start living like a man instead of a ghost." The filmmaker packed her equipment slowly, reluctant to break the spell of the story. "What happened to Capone after the arrests?" "Transferred to Terminal Island. Died there in 47, brain completely gone from the syphilis. But here's the thing." Vinny's eyes held a hard-won wisdom. "In the end, all that power, all that control, all those webs within webs, none of it mattered. He died alone, insane, forgotten by the very people who'd feared him." She walked toward her car, then turned back. "Was it worth it? Everything you sacrificed?" Vinny looked out at the water, where the sun was setting like a promise of tomorrow. Somewhere in Chicago, Danny's grandchildren were probably having dinner, laughing around a table in a world made safer by choices they'd never know about. Every sleepless night, he said quietly. Every year of prison. Every decade of running. Yes, it was worth it. The truth of it settled in his chest like an anchor finally finding the bottom. Not the weight of burden, but the solid certainty of home.